So here we are back with a new month, the first Wednesday of April, and it's time for our new reveal. So I have an embellishment theme and a background theme. So we'll start with the background theme, and the background is old quilt. So you need to try and source or find yourself a piece of old quilt. And the embellishment is country cottage. You can also do just a house if you want to. We just thought a pretty little cottage would be great. So they're the two themes we're going with this month. Okay, so I've got myself a piece of old quilt here, which I got from a lady called Laurie. I will link her Etsy store below. I got a couple of slow stitch packs from her, and it had the old quilt. And originally I was thinking I might use some toile, and I had this little, well, not such a little house, but a house and some Victorian sort of style ladies, and my plan was to stitch them down and embroider them, but then I completely changed my mind. And I decided to pull out a bunch of little scraps. Now these scraps are from old quilts, and some of these scraps are actually from this quilt that I'm using as my base for the background of this month's block. So I actually have trimmed this down to size, and I've pulled some bits and pieces like that orange piece there that actually comes from this quilt. And I really like the idea of using old bits of quilt to go with my old quilt background. I also love the fabrics. I think that there's some really beautiful ones, and you probably know by now that we all love old pieces of fabric, less new fabrics. So pretty much everything here is old, except maybe that stripe, the stripe at the top and the bottom might be newer fabric, but I just pulled those stripes out of my scrap box, but the rest have come from quilts. So what I want to do is I want to build up some layers with the bits of quilts, and then I want to stitch them down so it's like a solid stitched background. So I'm just auditioning my pieces to see what I like the look of, and I play around with them a bit until I decide where I'm going to stitch them. So just speeding my video up a little bit so that you don't spend the whole day watching me play around with tiny little pieces of scrap fabric. I initially start with the different pieces of quilt that I want to stitch down, and then I know I want to bring in some scraps of lace as well. So I've got some different scraps of lace, and I'm going to play around with them as well. So you'll actually get to see in this first week's video what my layout, or what I'm thinking my layout will be. And when I do come to stitch things, sometimes I change them around a bit. But generally you'll get the gist of what I'm looking at this month. So some pieces of lace along the edges, bits that are going to hang off like that bottom piece on the left, some bits that I've cut off old doilies, or they're already ripped doilies, and then I've got my little scraps of quilt as well. Okay, I know I definitely want one of those little red French labels that you can see there, and my house is going to be made out of old pieces of quilt as well. So these fabrics are all little pieces of quilt, again from vintage quilts. And then I've got a little blue trim there that I thought could be a nice scalloped roof along the edge of the roof. So that's my overall layout plan. That's my idea for this month's block. And just to show you how I'm going to piece together my background, firstly, I'm just pinning everything together just to hold it loosely in place. And then I'm going to use a normal sewing machine cotton, an old one, the one that I use quite regularly. You've seen it many times. And I'm just going to do a small running stitch to hold all the pieces of fabric together. So everything's now pinned down in place, and I'm getting my old sewing machine cotton, just a white one, and I do get quite a long piece. It definitely breaks the rule of how long you should have your thread, but I might have mentioned this before that I hate rethreading all the time, so I do tend to use longer pieces of thread for sewing. than probably what most people do. I'm pretty sure Rachel, my sister, she also does the same. Now I start off with this needle. It's quite a long and a little bit thick one. And I do stitch a little bit with it, but then I swap it because it's too thick and it's too hard to get through all the layers of fabric. Some parts of these fabric I could be trying to stitch through, 3 or 4 layers because it is an old quilt, including the wadding in the middle. So now having swapped to a smaller needle, it's much easier for me to get it through the fabric. So just a normal running stitch, Canthus style stitching. I'm just going horizontally across and I go back and forth until I have stitched down all my bits and pieces that I want to have as my background. So my video today is just going to be stitching all these pieces of fabric down because week 1 is focusing on our background. And then next week my plan will be to stitch down the different laces and possibly the base fabrics for my house is what I'd probably be aiming to do next week. In week 3 I will continue with some embellishments. I will probably put some decorations on my house and then possibly even start to create maybe some flowers to go alongside the house, and in the final week I'll finish off with my final embellishing. So that's the plan for this month. Only 4 Wednesdays in this month, not 5 like last month. And then after this we've only got 2 more months to go. So we've got May and then June, and then in sort of June or just after June we'll be showing you how we put our books together so you can get your first Roxy journal of stitchery, not Roxy's, but your journal of stitchery completed. And then, as we've said a few times, we do plan to go on to a second 6-month project, so don't worry. I know there's so many people loving this project just as much as we are loving seeing all your amazing things, particularly bits and pieces that we're seeing on Facebook. And also make sure that you do go and check out the hashtag on Instagram, because there's a few of my absolute favourite stitchers who are only posting on Instagram, and I wouldn't want you to miss them out as well. So there's such amazing inspiration. So much so that sometimes I'm looking at my blocks and thinking, oh wow, I feel like I need to redo them because other people's are so much better. But anyway, we're all different, and it's nice to see different ideas because it helps us along to inspire us as well. So the second 6-month project, I can't give too much away. I'm certainly not going to reveal it yet because Rachel will be watching this and she'll get angry if I do. And angry Rachel's not a nice Rachel. So it will obviously be related to slow stitching, this type of stitching that we're doing, but it's going to be a different theme. But it means that you will be able to continue along with a monthly project. In fact, you probably will be producing more than 1 block a month, but we'll reveal that later on. And the aim will be to finish off a second project by the end of the year, so by December, which will be exciting. So we hope that you are enjoying what we've been doing so far. We've certainly got lots and lots of followers who have joined the project on Facebook. Just in case any of your friends have tried to get in and they might have been rejected, the only reason we're rejecting people is if they're not answering the questions, because we feel like if you're not answering the questions, then you're possibly not a legitimate person wanting to learn or wanting to participate in slow stitching. And right at the beginning, we were accepting everyone, and we realised that we possibly accepted someone who was there to show photos of herself in her underpants, which we don't want to see, and I didn't think you want to see. So we realised we'd accidentally let her in and had to reject her because we think she was probably there and would start spamming us all with photos that we probably don't want to see. So if people are not answering the questions, we're not letting them in. As long as you're saying, yes, you're doing the project or you're interested to know more, then you're very welcome to join us. Even if you don't want to share your work, you just want to have a look what's going on and get some ideas and be inspired, maybe you will eventually join us. Or maybe you will join us for our second 6-month project. It's completely up to you. Don't feel like you have to be in that group and you have to share. I know some Facebook groups, they expect you to share, otherwise you get kicked out. We love to see what you're doing, but if you're not confident or you don't feel like your work's good enough, like I know some people feel like that, or you're afraid to share, that's okay. Eventually you might feel comfortable and decide that you will. There's a lot of people who have been like that and feeling a little bit intimidated by some of the amazing sewers. But please don't feel like that, because our group is nothing but positive, and I don't even think I've seen one negative comment. So don't feel worried about sharing your stuff. Everyone's super encouraging, and it's really nice to be encouraged, especially when you're new to something. All right, so I've got a few little tiny scraps that I'm going to add just to finish off my background at the top here. So this little tiny one, see, even the tiniest pieces of fabric can be used. I do really love a lot of these quilt pieces. I don't know, are they old feed sacks? I know I love feed sacks, but I don't know if they made these types of quilts out of them. I'd love to find a slow stitch pack that had lots of little bits like this. And I couldn't care less if they're little, because look at what you can do with them. You can just stitch a tiny piece there that's not very big, and even down the bottom you're going to see in a minute that I stitch an even tinier piece, and it just adds another dimension of colour, so another layer to make it more interesting. So, don't throw away your little tiny scraps if you're doing slow stitching. Maybe pop them in a bowl or pop them in a jar, and you might want to pull some out eventually and stitch them down. So across the bottom here I've got some striped fabric. Now that fabric, I think, as well as the striped one on the top left hand corner, are the only ones that probably aren't like quite old. But as I said, I just pulled them out of, I've got a big scrap bucket of fabrics, and I do like stripes. And now I'm playing around with my laces again, just to see how they're going to look on top of my bits of quilt stitched down, and thinking I'm going to frame it all up with some pieces of lace. And then am I going to place my house? No, I don't think so. I think I'm going to stitch across the bottom now. Super simple, stitching across the bottom again using my running stitch. So the only stitches that I'm doing on this background piece is a straight running stitch. Nothing fancy, no embellished kind of embroidery stitches, just a running stitch. To create, it's almost like, I guess, you're creating your own piece of fabric. So it's collaging all these bits of fabric down onto my old quilt block. And I don't want to cover the whole thing up. So you'll see that I'll kind of use that arch as kind of like a hill for my house. And I want to have some bits of that white poking through as well. But I've just added to my quilt block to make it more interesting. So again, you can see where my little my little house will go, made out of my vintage quilt. So my house is going to be simple, nothing too fancy. I'm not going to do crazy embroidery again. Keep this one pretty simple. I might do some embroidered flowers in my last couple of weeks. And finally, I'm almost done on my background piece. I've just ripped up another piece of quilt there. You can see the more colourful edges there were folded under, and the quilt top had completely faded. It would have been quite a bright fabric to begin with. So I'm stitching this little piece here down, which would have been a pink fabric originally. And then I've got a strip which I think might be the selvage of another piece of fabric that I've ripped out of the quilt. So this is the piece. See, that's brighter. That would have been folded under that bright piece, and then you can see that little piece on the edge there that would have been the top, and it's completely faded down. So I do like both looks. I like a bit of the bright so you can see what the original fabric was, and I do also like the faded down bit because you can tell that it's an old piece of quilt. So I've got that piece fully stitched down, and now a teeny tiny piece. Look how tiny that piece is. Just a little pop of aqua there. It's come from the same quilt as my background, where I just cut off the edges to trim down the size, and there was this little tiny piece of aqua fabric. So I'm stitching that down as well, and it just adds another layer and another colour down the bottom, and that aqua fabric is really pretty, like a pale kind of aqua. So background fully done. Even with all my playing around, this probably took me just a little bit over an hour to finish off and auditioning my different pieces until I made my decision. And this is now the background for my April block of Roxy's Journal of Stitchery. I hope you've enjoyed seeing how I've made my simple background, and I will see you again next week, where I will start to embellish by adding some lace and adding my house. Thanks for watching. See you soon. Bye.